So here's the story. August 10th, 1945. Two Japanese submarines are heading east across the Pacific Ocean, toward the Panama Canal. These were not ordinary submarines. Each one carried 3 aircraft, bombers, loaded, ready. The mission: destroy the locks of the Panama Canal. Without the canal, the American Navy couldn't move its fleet from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Without that ability, the war looked very different. 3 years of construction, 18 months of crew training, the largest submarines ever built, heading toward the one target that could change everything. August 15th. The radio operator received a transmission. Japan had surrendered. The aircraft were pushed over the side, into the Pacific. The weapons destroyed. Not by the enemy, by their own crew, following orders. The submarines turned around and headed home. The Panama Canal, untouched. 10 days, that's the margin. The largest submarine weapons program in the history of naval warfare missed its window by 10 days. Not weeks, not months. 10 days. The submarines were built, the crews were trained, the aircraft were ready. The target was selected. The orders were issued. Every single piece of the most ambitious underwater weapons program anyone had ever attempted, in position, 10 days before it could matter. Think about what that means. If the atomic bombs had been delayed by 2 weeks, if the Emperor's broadcast had come on August 25th instead of August 15th, the I-400 would have reached Ulithi. History runs on margins like this. 10 days. We are going to go back to where this started, to the man who ordered these submarines built, after Midway, after the carriers were gone, after he understood that Japan could not win the war it was fighting, and to what it cost to build the answer to a problem that had no good answers left. Because that's what the I-400 is. Not a superweapon, not a miracle. An answer to an impossible problem, built by engineers who were told to solve it anyway, operated by crews who knew what they were being asked, and deployed 10 days too late to matter. That's the story, and it starts in June of 1942, in the Pacific, after Midway, after everything changed. 3 years of engineering, 18 months of training, thousands of men and thousands of tons of steel. 10 days too late. The submarines were called the I-400 class, 122 meters long, the largest submarines in the world, by far. Nothing this size would be built again until the 1960s. Each one carried a pressurized hangar inside the hull. 3 aircraft, folded up, stored in the dark, waiting. A submarine that could launch an airstrike, then disappear beneath the surface. Nobody had ever built anything like this. Nobody had even tried. The engineering problems alone, a pressurized aircraft hangar inside a submarine hull, a catapult system that could launch a bomber from a surfaced submarine in under 15 minutes, a range of 60,000 miles without refueling, took 3 years to solve. And the man who ordered it built did it because he knew Japan was losing. Who gave that order, and why the Panama Canal, starts not in 1945. It starts in 1942. After Midway, after everything changed. June 1942. Midway. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers in 4 days. 4 carriers. The same carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Gone. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood what Midway meant better than anyone. Because here's the thing about Yamamoto. He had lived in Boston, studied at Harvard, spent time in the United States watching American industry, the steel mills, the shipyards, the factories that could churn out 4 carriers faster than Japan could build 2. He knew. He'd always known. Japan could not win a war of attrition against the United States, not in a straight fight, not fleet against fleet. So, don't fight the fleet. But what if you didn't fight the fleet? What if you cut it in half? The Panama Canal was the only passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific for large warships. Without it, the American Navy was two separate fleets, Atlantic on one side, Pacific on the other. To move ships from one ocean to the other without the canal, 6,000 miles around Cape Horn, weeks of sailing, months of delay. If Japan destroyed the canal, the Americans couldn't concentrate their naval power in the Pacific. They couldn't reinforce their fleet fast enough to stop Japan from fortifying its positions across the Pacific. The war that Japan was losing by fighting the American fleet could be extended by not fighting it at all. The problem, getting to Panama from Japan without being detected, required a submarine. But the aircraft that could actually damage the canal locks were too large to fit inside any submarine that existed. The aircraft needed for this mission didn't have a submarine to carry them. September 1942. Yamamoto signed the order. 18 submarines, each one carrying 3 aircraft, each aircraft carrying enough ordnance to destroy a lock. Nothing like this had ever been built. Nobody had ever tried. The engineers were being asked to solve problems that didn't have solutions yet, and to solve them fast enough to matter. Yamamoto never saw a single one of those submarines completed. In April of 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his flight schedule. He was flying an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. The route was precise. The time was exact. The Americans knew when and where he would be. P-38 fighters were waiting for him over Bougainville. His aircraft was shot down over the jungle. He was found still strapped in his seat. The admiral who had conceived the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had lived in America, who had understood American industrial power better than anyone in the Japanese military, died in a jungle knowing the war he had started was already lost. The program he ordered continued without him. Yamamoto was gone, but the order remained, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had committed to building the most ambitious submarine program in history, in the middle of a war they were losing. The engineers had been handed a list of impossible requirements: a pressurized aircraft hangar inside a submarine hull, a catapult that could launch a fully loaded bomber from a surfaced vessel, a range that could reach Panama from Japan without refueling. How they solved those problems, and what it cost to solve them, is what the inside of the I-400 actually looked like. 122 meters long. Just let that land for a second. A German U-boat, the submarine that terrorized the Atlantic for 4 years, was 76 meters. The I-400 was almost twice that. Displacement: 5,200 tons submerged. Nothing this size would exist again until nuclear submarines in the 1960s. Inside the hull, a pressurized cylindrical hangar, 3.6 meters in diameter, 34 meters long. Inside that hangar, 3 aircraft, folded up, wings back, tail down, packed in the dark like a puzzle someone had to solve in 12 minutes. The aircraft was called the Aichi M6A Seiran. It was designed specifically for this submarine. Folding wings, folding tail, folding floats. Everything that stuck out could be collapsed to fit inside the hangar. When assembled, it was a real aircraft, a bomber, capable of carrying a torpedo or 800 kilograms of conventional bombs. On the bow of the submarine, a pneumatic catapult, 26 meters long. It could accelerate a fully loaded Seiran from 0 to flying speed in under 2 seconds. The submarine would surface, the crew would open the hangar, pull out the aircraft, unfold everything, load the weapons, move to the catapult. 12 minutes, that was the target time. Think about what that means. You surface a submarine, You open a 34-meter hangar. You pull out an aircraft, unfold the wings, unfold the tail, attach the floats, load the bombs, roll it to the catapult, launch. 12 minutes. From surfaced submarine to aircraft in the air. Range, 60,000 miles without refueling. That's 1.5 times around the Earth. From Japan to Panama, roughly 10,000 miles, and back, with room to spare. No other submarine in any navy could get anywhere close to that range. There was one problem. The Submarine couldn't land on the submarine. There was no deck long enough, no arresting wires, nothing. After the mission, the pilots would ditch in the water next to the submarine and be picked up, or they would eject, or, if the mission was designated one way, they wouldn't come back at all. That decision hadn't been fully made yet when the war ended. The plan called for 18 of these submarines, 18, 3 squadrons, each one capable of launching 9 aircraft simultaneously. 27 bombers appearing out of nowhere, from beneath the ocean, hitting a target that no conventional aircraft could reach. Japan built 3. The war was eating everything. Steel that was supposed to go to the I-400 program went to destroyers that were being lost faster than they could be built. Workers who were supposed to be building submarines were reassigned to other programs. 18 submarines became 3, not because the program failed, but because the war was consuming Japan faster than Japan could consume the war. 3 submarines, 2 of them ready for combat by the summer of 1945. The I-400 and the I-401, and a target. The Panama Canal had been the target since 1942, but by 1945, the Japanese Navy was having second thoughts. The canal was well defended, American anti-submarine patrols covered the approaches, and there was another option, one that the Navy had started to consider in the final months before the mission launched. What that option was, and how close it came to being used, is in the orders that the crews received before they left port. Here's the part that's hard to talk about. While Japan was building the I-400, Japan was losing the war. Not slowly, not gradually. Fast. Really fast. Guadalcanal, 1942. Japan committed 24,000 men. Fewer than 10,000 came back. The naval losses alone, 24 warships, consumed steel and fuel that the I-400 program was supposed to get. The Philippine Sea, June 1944. Japan lost 3 carriers and over 400 aircraft in 2 days. The pilots the I-400 needed, experienced, trained aviators who could fly a Siran from a submarine catapult at dawn, were dying faster than the submarines were being built. Inside the Japanese Navy, there was a fight. Traditional officers wanted resources for conventional forces, destroyers, conventional submarines, ships that could fight now, not a revolutionary weapon that might be ready in 3 years if everything went perfectly. Everything was not going perfectly. The I-400 was laid down at Kure in January of 1942. The I-401 was laid down at Sasebo 6 months later. Under normal conditions, building something this complex would take 4 years. Japan didn't have 4 years. The engineers worked around the clock. The workers were shifted from other programs. The steel came from reserves that other ships needed. Then the bombing started. In November of 1944, B-29s began hitting Japanese industrial cities. The shipyards that were building the I-400 were on the target list. Construction slowed. Workers were killed. Facilities were damaged. The program that was supposed to produce 18 submarines produced 3. Not because the engineers failed, not because the concept was wrong, because Japan was running out of everything: steel, workers, time, fuel, faster than the program could absorb it. In December of 1944, the I-400 was commissioned. I-401 the following month. The largest submarines ever built, ready for their mission. In a country where the cities were burning, the fleet was shattered, and the Americans were already bombing the home islands. The weapon that was supposed to change the war was finished. 3 years late. In a war that had already moved past the point where it could help. The B-29s were bombing Japanese cities every night. The American fleet had already bypassed most of Japan's island defenses. The home islands were next. Planners in Washington were already writing the invasion orders, Operation Downfall, the assault on Kyushu scheduled for November of 1945. The I-400 was commissioned in December of 1944, 11 months before the invasion it was supposed to prevent. The engineering had been brilliant. The timing had been catastrophic. And here's what nobody talks about. The men who built it knew. The engineers knew. The welders knew. The designers knew. They could hear the B-29s overhead. They could see the fires in the cities. They built it anyway, because the alternative was to stop building and accept what stopping meant. And they weren't ready to accept that. Not yet. The submarines were ready. The mission was not. Because in the years since Yamamoto had signed the order, the target had changed. Panama was still on the table, but by early 1945, the Japanese Navy was looking at something else, something closer, something that might actually work with the time they had left, something that, if it had been used, would have changed not just the war, but what came after it. What the crews were actually ordered to do when they left port is the part of this story that stayed classified for decades. The order arrived in June of 1945. Operation Hikari. Hikari means light. The target was no longer Panama. Panama was too far, too well defended, too uncertain. The new target, Ulithi Atoll, a coral atoll in the western Pacific, where the American Navy had assembled one of the largest concentrations of warships in history. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, hundreds of ships preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. If Japan could destroy those carriers, the invasion would be delayed, months maybe, not stopped. Japan's commanders were not deluded about the final outcome, but delayed. And in 1945, delay was the strategy. Every month the invasion was postponed was another month for Japan to negotiate something other than unconditional surrender. Now, here's the part that stayed classified for decades, and it's ugly. The original version of Operation Hikari called for biological weapons. Plague, cholera, delivered by aircraft onto American bases in the Mariana Islands. Not bombs, disease. The plan came from Unit 731, Japan's biological warfare research program in Manchuria. They had spent years developing this very capability. The plan existed. It was detailed. It was approved at the highest levels of the Japanese military. It was canceled approximately 1 month before the submarines left port. The reason given? Fear of American retaliation in kind. The real reason was probably simpler. The biological weapons were unreliable. You couldn't guarantee they would spread the way the models predicted. You couldn't guarantee they wouldn't spread back to Japanese forces. Conventional bombs were more predictable. The biological weapons plan was abandoned. The submarines went to sea with conventional ordnance. Which is the only reason the story can be told the way it is. Why canceled? The official reason, concern about retaliation. If Japan used biological weapons against American forces, the Americans might respond in kind. Against Japanese cities that were already burning. The plan was abandoned. Conventional bombs only. Captain Tatsunori Ariizumi commanded the I-401. He received the orders. He read them. 6 aircraft, 2 submarines, 1 target. Hundreds of American warships at Ulithi. He knew what 6 aircraft against hundreds of warships actually meant. He went anyway. Because there was a word the Japanese military used for this kind of mission. Tokol. Special attack. The understanding that the mission might not be survivable, and going anyway because the mission was more important than survival. Arizumi had commanded submarines on Tokol missions before. He understood what he was being asked. He signed the departure orders. He went anyway. The order exists. Dated, signed, specific. A target, a date, a method. The document that described an attack that never happened, because the war ended 10 days before the submarines could get there. Arizumi also received a second order. If the submarine was in danger of capture, destroy everything. The Seidan aircraft, the catapult, the hangar, the technical documents, the operation orders. Nobody was supposed to know what was inside. The submarines left port on July 17, 1945. I-400. I-401, heading east, toward Ulithi. They had been at sea for less than a month when the radio transmission came. August 15th, Japan had surrendered. The crews heard it in the control room. What happened in the next few minutes, on both submarines, is the part of this story that the captains never fully agreed on in their testimony afterward. July 17, 1945. I-400 and I-401 left Maizuru Naval Base, heading east. The crews had been briefed on the mission. They knew what 6 aircraft against the American fleet actually meant. The crossing was made submerged. American anti-submarine patrols were everywhere. The submarines ran deep, ran slow. Radio silence. Just the sound of the ocean and the engines, and the knowledge of what was waiting at the other end. August 6th, Hiroshima. The crews didn't know. Radio silence. They were somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, running deep, while above them, on the surface of history, everything was changing. August 9th, Nagasaki. Still radio silence, still running east, still 2 days from Ulithi, 2 days from the target. August 15th. The radio operator broke silence to receive a transmission. Emperor Hirohito was speaking. The first time in Japanese history that the emperor had spoken directly to his people. His voice. If you've never heard the recording, it's strange, formal, almost otherworldly. Difficult to understand even for native Japanese speakers through the static and the formal court language. But the meaning was clear enough. Japan had surrendered. Captain Arizumi read the order. He read it twice. Then he read the second order, the one that had come with every operation order since the submarines left port. If capture is imminent, destroy everything. The Seidan aircraft were brought out of the hangar, one by one. The aircraft that had been designed from scratch for this one submarine. The aircraft that men had spent 2 years folding, storing, maintaining, keeping ready for a mission that was now cancelled. They were pushed over the side, into the Pacific. Just pushed them off. 3 aircraft from I-401, 3 from I-400. 6 aircraft. Gone. The submarines turned west and headed home. The Panama Canal, untouched. The American fleet at Ulithi, untouched. The war, over. The I-400 had traveled thousands of miles, submerged, silent, undetected. It had done everything it was designed to do, except the one thing it was built for. The mission that 3 years of engineering and 18 months of training and thousands of tons of steel had been assembled to execute never happened. Not because the submarines failed, because the calendar ran out. Here's where the testimony gets complicated. Arizumi had commanded submarines throughout the war. He had ordered the execution of prisoners from torpedoed merchant ships. He knew what it meant to be captured by the Americans. On I-401, he ordered the destruction of documents, the wiping of charts, the shredding of operation orders. Everything that could tell the Americans what the mission had been. Everything that could connect the submarine to what it had been designed to do. On I-400, the commander was more cautious about what he destroyed. Some documents survived. Some technical specifications were left intact. The Americans would find things that Ariazumi didn't know about. And what they found was enough. The two submarines made their way back toward Japan. They were intercepted by American naval vessels before they reached port. Ariazumi did not survive the surrender. Before the Americans boarded his submarine, he shot himself on the bridge. His crew watched it happen. What the Americans found when they boarded the I-400 and the I-401 was enough to make them immediately classify everything. In late August of 1945, American prize crews boarded the I-400 and the I-401 in Tokyo Bay. These guys had seen captured Japanese vessels before: destroyers, cruisers, conventional submarines. They were not prepared for this. The first thing everyone mentioned afterward was the size. These men had served on submarines. They knew what a submarine looked like inside. This was not that. The corridors were wide enough to walk without turning sideways, which, if you've ever been inside a submarine, that's insane. The hangar ran the length of a city block. The catapult on the bow, designed to launch a fully loaded bomber, was a piece of engineering that no Allied Navy had attempted. The engineers went to work immediately. Everything was photographed, everything was measured, everything was cataloged. The pressurized hangar, the catapult mechanism, the aircraft recovery crane, the fuel storage system, the navigation equipment. Some of Ariazumi's destruction had been incomplete. Documents survived. Technical manuals survived. Enough to understand how it all worked. The classification order came within days. Everything about the I-400, its capabilities, its mission, its specifications, classified. Not just restricted, classified at the highest levels. Here's why. The Potsdam Conference had divided the post-war world. The Soviet Union was an ally, technically. It had entered the war against Japan in its final days. It had a seat at the table. It had rights to inspect captured enemy equipment. A Soviet inspection commission was scheduled to arrive in Japan. They had a list of Japanese weapons they wanted to examine. The I-400 class submarines were on that list. The Americans had a problem. They couldn't refuse the Soviet inspection outright. That would be a diplomatic incident in a relationship that was already becoming complicated. The Soviets had fought Japan in the final weeks of the war. They had territorial agreements. They had rights under the post-war arrangements that were being hammered out at the same time Japan was still surrendering. But the Americans also couldn't let the Soviets see what was inside the I-400. The aircraft hangar, the catapult system, the range. The concept of a submarine that could strike targets thousands of miles away without ever being detected. In 1945, that wasn't just a wartime weapon. That was a Cold War weapon. A weapon the Soviet Union did not yet have. The solution: the submarines had to be gone before the Soviets arrived. In 1946, the I-400 and the I-401 were taken to Hawaii. They were scuttled, sunk deliberately, off the coast of Oahu. The official reason? Compliance with post-war disarmament treaties. The actual reason? The Soviet Inspection Commission was arriving the following week. The largest submarines ever built, sunk by the country that had captured them. Not because they were dangerous, because of what they knew. The Cold War had already started in Tokyo Bay in 1945, before most people realized the Cold War had started. What the Americans learned from the I-400 before they sank it, and how that knowledge changed American submarine design for the next 20 years, is the part of the story that explains why the submarines are still classified in some respects to this day. Before they sank the I-400, The Americans studied it for months. Every system, every mechanism, every engineering solution the Japanese had developed to make a submarine carry aircraft. They wrote reports, they built models, they drew conclusions. 10 years later, the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. Range unlimited. The concept that a submarine could travel vast distances without surfacing, without refueling, without being detected, had been proven by the I-400. The engineers who designed the Nautilus had read the classified reports. 4 years after that, USS George Washington, the first submarine to carry ballistic missiles, a vessel that could launch weapons from beneath the ocean, aimed at targets thousands of miles away, without ever being seen. The concept of a submarine as a launch platform for weapons other than torpedoes had been demonstrated by the I-400's aircraft catapult in 1945. The weapon changed. The concept didn't. The Soviet Union had its own submarine aviation program in the 1950s, Project 640, aircraft-carrying submarines, launched from below the surface. The Soviets officially claimed they developed it independently. American intelligence believed otherwise. Whether information about the I-400 reached Moscow, through espionage, through captured documents, through the inspection commission that never got to see the actual submarines, has never been definitively established. The American documents on the I-400 were partially declassified in the 1960s, by which point the United States Navy already had nuclear submarines carrying ballistic missiles on patrol. The George Washington class, the Ethan Allen class, submarines that could strike targets on the other side of the Earth from beneath the ocean, without surfacing, without being detected, without any warning. The I-400 had carried aircraft. These submarines carried missiles. The weapon changed. The concept, a submarine as a strategic strike platform, capable of projecting force against targets far beyond the range of conventional naval warfare, was the same concept that the Japanese engineers had solved in 1943. The secret had been superseded by its own children. And by the time the documents were declassified, nobody needed to be told how to build one anymore. In 2013, a NOAA research vessel was conducting surveys off the coast of Hawaii. The sonar contact at 700 meters depth was large, very large. It was the I-400, hull intact, the hangar visible through the sonar imaging, sitting on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, right where the Americans had sunk it in 1946. 2 years later, I-401 found nearby. The two submarines that had been heading for Ulithi, that had turned around when the war ended, that had been scuttled to keep a secret, were both on the bottom, 700 meters down, preserved by the cold and the dark. The secret they were sunk to protect was already obsolete by the time the submarines hit the bottom. The Americans had taken what they needed. The Soviets had figured out their own version. The Cold War had moved on to weapons that made aircraft-carrying submarines look quaint. But the I-400 was still down there, with its hangar, its catapult, its empty aircraft racks. And the question that the wreck can't answer: what would have happened if the war had lasted 10 more days? August 1945. 2 submarines heading east. Same submarines we started with. But now we know. We know what was inside. The hangar, the aircraft, the catapult, the orders. The 3 years of everything it took to get them to this point in the Pacific Ocean. 2 days away from Ulithi. 2 days away from the target. 6 aircraft against one of the largest concentrations of American naval power in history. What would have happened if they'd reached it? Honest answer? Nobody knows. 6 aircraft against hundreds of warships. The damage could have been significant, or it could have been absorbed. Here's what we do know. Operation Downfall, The planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands was scheduled for November of 1945. American planners estimated between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties in the millions. If the I-400's attack had delayed the American fleet by even a few weeks, the calculus of everything that followed would have shifted. Not reversed, shifted. Japan surrendered. The invasion never happened. The submarines turned around. The aircraft went into the Pacific. And the question of what would have happened if they'd arrived stayed a question. The I-400 is still on the bottom, 700 meters down, off the coast of Hawaii. The hull that the American engineers studied in 1945 is sitting in the dark of the Pacific. The hangar is still there, empty now. I-401 is nearby, 2 submarines, built to carry the weapon that would change the war, sunk by the country that captured them, found 70 years later by a research vessel doing something else entirely. 10 days. That's the margin between what happened and what almost happened. Between the I-400 completing its mission and the I-400 at the bottom of the Pacific. Between a war that lasted into 1946 and a war that ended on August 15, 1945. 10 days. Yamamoto knew Japan would lose. He built the I-400 anyway, because delay was the only strategy that remained. Every month the war continued was another month to negotiate. Every obstacle to the invasion was another piece of leverage. The I-400 was not a weapon of victory. It never was. It was a weapon of negotiation. And that's the part that makes this story what it is. 10 more days, and that negotiation might have happened from a different position. Or it might have made no difference at all. That's the thing about margins this small. You never know what was on the other side of them. The people who built the I-400 knew this. The engineers who solved the pressurized hangar problem. The pilots who trained to assemble a Saran in 12 minutes in the dark. The crew who lived inside a submarine the size of a cruiser for months at a time. They knew the war was lost. They built it anyway, not because they believed it would win, but because building it was the only way to stay in the fight long enough to see what came next. What came next was August 15th, and the submarines turned around, and the aircraft went into the water. And the war ended. 10 days before they could find out what was on the other side of that margin. The I-400 is still out there, 700 meters down, in the dark. The hangar empty, the catapult unused, the aircraft gone, pushed over the side by the crew that built everything to use them, waiting for a war that ended 10 days too soon. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with new videos, share your comments, and give us a like if you enjoyed it.